And it looks like we're live. Yep, there we go. Fantastic. So, Kirk, thanks again for coming on for the second time to have our follow up conversation. Would you mind telling us again a little bit about yourself for those who did not see the first time?
Sure. I'm Canadian, and I am a philosopher as well as a scientist, and suppose people would call me a theologian to quite a degree, I suppose. And my job over the last 35 years has been primarily university students and professors looking at the interrelationship between God, philosophy, and science, and dealing with questions that arise in that arena. Um, Also married, have 6 kids, 6 grandkids, and I really enjoy the outdoors, wilderness, canoeing, camping. It's pretty hard to beat.
Fantastic. So, last time we talked a lot about evidence like the cosmological argument. And this time I wanted to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned the historicity and the moral argument. Could you tell us a little bit about why you find those compelling?
Well, I think compelling is probably in the eye of the beholder, but at least I'll run by the historical argument. Let me begin with that. I think that's the simpler one. The moral argument is is I think quite compelling, not perhaps intellectually, but emotionally. But let me start with the historical argument. Basically, it would go like this, something like this. So, if it does, if there does need to be a reason to believe that that the universe was brought into existence by an eternal, non-physical, supernatural mind. When I say supernatural, I mean not determined by space-time, matter, and energy, and the laws of physics. Then a question that could arise late at night, sitting around the fire, might be, well, okay, has this being ever stepped into the physical universe, and specifically, has this person ever stepped into human history and interacted with us? So we might want to take a look at history and see if anyone has ever claimed to be God. And immediately we do have a bit of a problem, because various people have claimed to be God. I've met two myself, one at University of British Columbia and the other at the University of Manitoba. And I suppose, to be polite, we shouldn't just outright laugh out loud or anything when someone claims to be God. Rather, it might be better to ask them why we should take their claims seriously. And in the two cases I mentioned there, they could provide me with no reason at all to believe they were telling the truth or to take their claims seriously. But when we look at history, there is one person who claimed to be God and who has some highly unusual warrant that I believe that maybe he was telling the truth, and it should come as no surprise that I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth. So I would summarize it in the form of a syllogism. Um, I would say Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be God. Proposition number two: there are at least two lines of warrant for taking his claim seriously. And then the third is just a logical inference from the first two propositions. Therefore, there are at least two lines of warrant to believe that God exists and has interacted with humanity. That would be it summarized in a syllogism. And the first one, I think, is perhaps the first proposition, that Christ claimed to be God, is perhaps relatively uncontroversial. I know that there seems to be a consensus amongst in the academic world on at least three things about Jesus of Nazareth, and one of them is that he made these sorts of claims, or believed that he was. It's not, they of course wouldn't grant that he actually was, but he actually made those claims. And the third the logical conclusion just follows from the first two premises, but it's the second proposition that is the controversial one, and that is that there are at least two lines of warrant for taking his claims seriously. And that is the proposition that I think requires the most work and the most to defend. Assuming that that is done, however, I said this is a syllogism. It is not a proof. It is not a proof that God exists and has interacted with humanity. It is just an argument to support that, or to provide some rational justification for that. So what are the two lines of warrant? First of all, I would, and I don't assume to know what the average person I'm talking to knows about the Bible, but basically it's written in two sections. There's one section called the Old Testament, and the unanimous consensus in the academic world is that the Old Testament was written prior to the time of Christ. They might argue about exactly how long before the time of Christ. Some might say, a couple of 100 years. Others would say older, but it would all agree it was written prior to the time of Christ. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm talking about the first line of warrant here, maybe I should tell you what the first line of warrant is that there are ancient messianic prophecies that Christ appeared to have fulfilled. And that is, there's a couple of unique things about that in human history. You don't have a whole lot of that going on elsewhere in human history, making prophecies or predictions about the future that can be verified or falsified. And the other unique thing about it is that it appears that these prophecies can be divided into two sections, one pertaining to the first coming of the Messiah and the other pertaining to the end of the world. And the ones pertaining to the first coming of the Messiah appear to have been fulfilled. Now, again, I use the word appear here, and of course that's a matter of discussion and argument. But that would, I think, and the reason that I mentioned that the Old Testament was written prior to the time of Christ is that it sets itself up possible falsification or verification, and I really like that approach, in that if those prophecies never came true, then I think we have a serious problem believing that the Old Testament has anything pertaining to God. People would argue about how much the Old Testament comes from God, and that's a whole spectrum of discussion there. But if the prophecies pertaining to the Messiah never came true, then that pretty much blows out the central core of Christianity. Not completely, because there's the second line of warrant, and I would suggest that the second line of warrant is that there appears to be some decent historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose from the dead. And again, not proof, just evidence that would support that. So those would be the two lines of warrant, highly unusual warrant for maybe taking his claim seriously. And I think that would summarize this historical argument for the existence of God, which I laid out in three premises. Number one, Jesus claimed to be God. Number two, there's some highly unusual warrant for maybe taking his claim seriously, and therefore it logically follows, if those two premises are granted, that there is highly unusual warrant for the belief that God may have interacted with humanity.
Interesting. So from my perspective, I remember researching Mike Lacona's work. He's a Christian historiographer, and one of the quotes I found of him really interesting was the fact that he said there's no clear scriptures. There are no clear scriptures that predicted Jesus would rise from the dead. It's a quote from Michael Lacona from the Old Testament. So it seems like a stretch to say that it's a clear prediction that he would rise from the dead from the Old Testament. So that one I find harder to believe or harder to accept as a form of evidence. And the second one was Jesus' resurrection. And from my perspective, I don't think any amount of testimony is reasonable to believe in miracles of like a resurrection. And I think that's because, like, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe that. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. And the difference between these two claims is that in addition to my testimony that I saw it, there's an implicit empirical basis behind the dog. Like there's lots of scientific evidence behind dogs that we can verify that they just haven't mentioned in the statement. So like their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, chemical composition, bone structure, how to train them, what they're allergic to, all of that stuff exists empirically, even though I haven't mentioned it in the statement. It's just implicit in that statement, dog, whereas none of that exists for unicorns. So it's reasonable to believe me if I told you I saw a dog, but not reasonable to believe me if I told you I saw a unicorn, because it doesn't have that empirical basis behind it. And so it seems to me that it's not reasonable to believe testimony of any kind if it doesn't come with an empirical basis. So that would mean it's not reasonable to believe testimony for miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs, any of those kinds of claims, which seems to be the consensus in history. Another quote from Michael Licona I found is that most biblical scholars and historians hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. So it seems like most historians take the idea that testimony isn't sufficient reason to believe in miracles, because it wouldn't be like admissible in a courtroom either. If you came with like 500 eyewitnesses said that somebody cast a magic spell to kill someone, well, it'd just be thrown out of the courtroom because there's no precedent for the legal technical term. And so the testimony itself isn't sufficient to justify things that don't have an empirical basis. So that would be my position on those two lines of evidence for the historicity. And also, a third question would be, is the resurrection sufficient evidence to believe that you are in fact the creator of the universe? I mean, simply raising someone from the dead, I'm not sure if that would be sufficient evidence to really make belief that that person is in fact the creator of the universe instead of just a really powerful person or something.
Well, you've raised some really good objections, and I will try and handle them one at a time, or maybe we can wade through them one at a time, if I can recall what they all were once I get into it. Let's start with the first one. The Old Testament has no clear prophecies that the Messiah would rise from the dead. There's two ways to approach that. One method would be to argue about certain prophecies and say, yeah, but what is the best understanding of, let's say, Isaiah chapter 53, for example. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one because I think there's a better approach, but let me just touch on that one. There are several in the Old Testament that seem to indicate that there'd be someone whose body will not undergo decay. That's one of them. It's rather enigmatic. I call them enigmatic prophecies. These are prophecies that perhaps at the time when the people listened to them, they would say, what does that mean? What's he talking about? And it doesn't make sense to me. And I am not sure they would have associated them with some sort of Messiah coming in the future. But hold that thought, because I think it's a very important one. But let's go back to Isaiah 53. You could infer this resurrection by starting in the end of chapter 52, working through. And you notice that the tense that is being used there switches back and forth from past to future. And the tense, the prophet, he saw something. He saw the future, and then he's telling the people what he saw. And so he's speaking in a past tense, but when you begin to divide it up into past and future tenses, you'll notice that almost all the future tenses has the Messiah as something that'll an amazing person. All the kings of the world will worship and so forth. But in the past tense, he's having a really hard time. This individual is being spoken of in Isaiah 53, and one of them is that he's cut off, he's killed. All the sins of humanity are laid on him. But then it talks about the future that as a result, he'll rule and everything else. And so there's an inference there that although this Messiah is, the word cut off is a Hebrew idiom, by the way, for getting killed or executed. The implication is that he's killed the sins of humanity, but that for some reason he comes back to life and rules humanity. Now, as I said, that is only an implication. And so let's grant for this, the sake of argument, that all the Old Testament verses that seem to point towards a resurrection of this messianic figure really don't clearly specify that and only imply it. And at that stage, we then have to look and say, well, okay, what other alternatives do we have to understand these passages? and then the alternatives can be put on the table. We discuss which alternative seems to fit the context the best, and we arrive at conclusions, and that can get involved in boring discussion amongst theologians and exegetes. However, I'd like to focus on this idea of enigmatic prophecies, because that to me, and I have not heard anybody else talk about this. I first went through all the prophecies a long time ago, let's just say, and I noticed that when they were all listed by there were ones that were very clear prophecies about the Messiah, but then there were a number that they referred to that whoever wrote the articles asserted were messianic prophecies. But when I actually went through them, I could see, okay, I can see how after the fact they fit. But at the time they were made, I really don't think people knew what they were talking about. Here's one, for example. It's prophesied that one day the Messiah would be, sorry, not the Messiah. One day God would be valued at 30 pieces of silver. That money would be thrown in a temple and go to a potter. At the time, what? Like God valued at 30 pieces? This doesn't make any sense at all. And there's a number like that, including the resurrection of prophecies. Now, here's the point. In general, in science, in history, in many different fields of research, if you have a theory and that explains a particular set of facts, and then you look at that theory and you discover, hey, that also explains a bunch of other things we had no idea were even associated with this, then the credibility of that theory, regardless of what field of study this is substantially improved, because not only does it explain the known facts at hand, but it also has explanatory power for things that you initially had no idea were associated with this. But the theory covers that as well. And it wasn't planning to. It was kind of after the fact. So what I see, here's what I find something curious and fascinating going on with these prophecies, is that there are a number of specific ones. And so let's say some guy later on decides, hey, I think I'd like to try out for the position of Messiah here. What are those prophecies? And they would go over them all and let's see if I can pull them off, type of thing. They would never think to pull off the enigmatic ones, the ones that made no sense. There's kind of statements embedded in the past that will make no sense until the events come true. And so along comes Jesus of Nazareth, and he's to be fulfilling some of these ancient prophecies. And then after the fact, as at the end of his life and in retrospect, we suddenly realize, wait a sec. If he is the Messiah, not only did he appear to fulfill some of these ancient specific messianic prophecies, but there's a whole set of enigmatic sayings and statements in the Old Testament that made no sense at the time, but make perfect sense. Another example would be Psalm 22, where we see somebody, we won't use the word crucified because they didn't really do that in Judea in about 1000 AD, 1,000 years before Christ, I should say. But we see a person whose hands and feet are being pierced. They're casting lots for his garments. He's yelling, "Oh my God, why have you forsaken me?" And people would read that and say, "Whoa, like I have no idea what this psalm is talking about." After the fact, however, suddenly psalms like 22, 69, other these ancient statements suddenly begin to make sense. And it's a way of encrypting things in the past to safeguard against all the false messiahs that would come up and just fulfill the obvious prophecies. So that's just a thought that I've had regarding these. And so in my mind, these enigmatic statements in the past that don't come right out and say, someday a person will come, Jesus of Nazareth, and he'll be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver and so forth. No. It doesn't clearly say this is Jesus of Nazareth at all. It just says it's God, or God says, I'm valued at this. But after the fact, all these enigmatic ones make more sense. And so in my mind, I argue that these these oblique, vague statements in the past, these enigmatic ones that made no sense at the time, actually add further credibility to the hypothesis that Jesus of Nazareth is actually who he claimed to be, and he is the Messiah. Not a proof, again, of course, and it's just something to throw out there and people to mull over.
So my thoughts on that would be that looking back at the Old Testament prophecies that do seem enigmatic, someone in the writing the Gospels of the New Testament, looking at Jesus' story, could probably try and make them fit, and say, well, Judas was paid for turning in Jesus, but well, let's make this amount exactly 30, because then it kind of fits with this other story, and it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I don't think we have any independent corroboration of those kinds of facts about the Gospels. Most of them are just like, there was a guy named Jesus, or these Christians mention this guy named Jesus. I think for like Josephus, and I forgot his name, the guy that starts with the T. The most of the extra biblical historians who mention Jesus don't really go into that much detail about his life, and so a lot of those really specific seeming prophecies could simply be additions to the Gospels from the writers later. So I don't think we have any way to verify they're actually accurate predictions. I mean, if they were, that would be pretty good evidence. I definitely would agree that, but I don't think we have any way to show that they were in fact accurate predictions.
Well, as with any historical investigation, you will have a small collection of statements, or maybe a couple of writings, regardless of what in history we're looking at. And even today in the modern courtroom, we cannot possibly or usually verify 100% of what every witness is saying, because we can't, go back in time and watch those things. And there may be facts in the courtroom that are presented as facts that we would really like to be able to verify, but there's only two witnesses saying this, and so we have to test the credibility of the witnesses themselves. And so in the end, what they look for is this person guilty beyond reasonable doubt? And it's usually on the basis of what evidence they have. It's not like, do we know for a fact, can we prove this person guilty? It's just, what's been so this goes back, I think, to an historical discussion. It's very apropos to the New Testament writers. Were they kind of writing up the life of Christ in a way that would nicely fit with these Old Testament prophecies, especially the blatant ones, but also the ones that weren't even regarded as Old Testament prophecies at the time, back then, but perhaps by then they thought, hey, let's write this in. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is, if they were enigmatic at the time, why would they think when they're writing up the life of Christ that, hey, let's take some of these, let's go through the, let's see if we can find some enigmatic ones, and let's add that to the mix. Because they didn't know at the time what this is talking about, and if Jesus actually wasn't betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and that money thrown in the temple after Judas, felt remorse for what he's done, and or given by a potter's field, as a burial place for strangers. If that actually didn't happen, then the prophecy still, in fact, they wouldn't even know it's a prophecy. They would just think it's some poetic statement in the past. And so the motive or the idea to, let's write this into the life of Christ, I'm not sure would have occurred to them any more than it would have occurred to any Jew living in prior times since those initial statements were made. So I'm just not sure about that. But, it is a possibility, as you suggest. There is a possibility that could be. The question is, do we have any grounds? Do we have any grounds to take that possibility seriously? Like you've just suggested, maybe they wrote this in, but what grounds would there be? What would your argument be for them basically writing stuff they know is not true? What would your argument be?
Well, I wouldn't go as so far to say that they don't think it's true. I would say something like, they know Judas was paid to give up Jesus, but they didn't know the amount. And so when reading and contemplating the Old Testament, they see there's this 30 amount that God is weighed at 30. And then like, oh, well, maybe that's exactly what Judas was paid, because they may or may not have known exactly what he was paid. And so they can insert that finite amount to make it fit the correlation to the Old Testament. So it's still true that he was paid, but the exact amount may or may not be exactly that. And that was just a number they fabricated to fit the past event.
Yeah. Well, it is a hypothesis. It is a theory, and I think we shouldn't be afraid to put any theory on the table and examine that. I'm not sure they wouldn't have known what the amount was if that bit about Joseph of Arimathea is true. And there's a good reason to believe it is true. If he was a member of the Sanhedrin, he would probably have known what transpired in this transaction. And to write Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, into this account, if he actually wasn't, is a way to get instantly discredited. Like, I would not want to say that one of the governing members of our country has on, he did this and that, and I'm just making stuff up, because I'm going to get exposed pretty fast, because I'm not talking about some Joe Blow down the road here. I'm just talking about someone who everybody knows. So I think now we don't know that, of course. We don't know that Joseph of Arimathea did know the amount. But I think there is actually, what it does suggest is that there is a very plausible way that they could have known what that amount was. But still, that doesn't disprove your theory, nor does it prove that I'm right. It's just we have to weigh all these things if we're doing an historical investigation. And I would say if there's a plausible way to know how that 30 pieces came about, and the hypothesis that they wrote this in still lacks some, I would say, some rational justification. Now, we could make up some rational justification. They got lots of women, or they got lots of money, or they got lots of power, none of which really come to pass for those men. But let's say they thought they would get that, then I suppose we could say that. But again, conjecture without any kind of historical basis to it is it's a hypothesis, but just how seriously should we take it? But I think there's another way to test the writers of the New Testament Gospels, and there's a recent book by Peter J. Williams. He is warden of Tyndale House at Durstan, and he goes into looking at the details of these accounts, frequency of name usage. So if they are kind of cooking up a story, there's a number of things they're probably not going to get right in the details that actually historically we can collaborate, and archaeologically we can collaborate. And even what kind of trees grow in, for example, that mostly don't grow anywhere else in Israel or in that area of the Mediterranean. Small historical details that now we're increasingly being able to confirm from history and archaeology. So it doesn't prove that they're telling the truth, but what it does show, if they got the story right in the small details, then chances are the big stuff they're probably getting right as well. And we still have to acknowledge, even if we are an extreme skeptic, that something massive happened in the first century in Judea that caused a major explosion of religious belief that spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. And if Christ was, and the earliest evidence that we have is that the reason was they believed he'd actually risen from the dead. And so this doesn't prove that he did. And this is why I said at the outset that my historical argument here is not a proof. It is an argument. But I think if we were to break this down, like we have started to, we were starting to look at individual back and forth responses, that's where the argument really gets tested, I think. and alternative hypothesis can be tested. And this is what Lacona does do in his book. He does look at several other theories. I think there's 6, and then maybe one he tacks on as right at the end. But he looks at each one of these hypotheses that, to see which has the best explanatory power using historiographical criteria that he lays out. And in the end, he concludes that the theory or the hypothesis that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead seems to satisfy the criteria, all of the criteria, in a way that none of the other hypotheses does. But there's still a major problem, and you mentioned that at the beginning, is the problem of miracles. That would be a blatant miracle if that occurred. And we haven't really talked about the problem of miracles. Lacona does in his book, but we can discuss that as well. So let me pause here and just say, I've laid out the historical argument, but I think it's up to the person to pursue that, which I did beginning around grade 11, to see how well does this actually stand up. And over time, I became impressed with it.
Oh, one last comment on the historical argument is that, like, Mike Lacona had a debate with Bart Ehrman, and he said that first, Bart asserts that the majority of scholars outside of a purely Christian context do not regard the Gospels as being historically reliable, and I agree. Or Michael Lacona is saying that he agrees that most biblical scholars outside of a Christian context don't find them reliable. Do you think that this is purely biased, that they don't consider the Gospels reliable, or that they have good reason not to think that the Gospels are reliable?
I hate to accuse anybody of bias. It just doesn't fly well when you're having discussions with those very people. I would say, though, we're all probably biased. I mean, I would say I am biased. I mean, it's virtually impossible not to have preconceived notions and so forth that shape how we view things. So that's a case right there. And then it depends also on how much slack people are willing to cut. I know in the Western world here, we tend to read accounts much differently than ancient Middle Eastern writers, not just in the Bible, but all over, tended to write. For example, if we in the Western world are reading a narrative and we see a sequence of events, we automatically assume this is chronological order. But that's been pointed out by various scholars. No, we cannot make that assumption at all, unless it clearly specifies, like, for example, Luke specifies going to write in chronological order. And there's a number of things that some of the academic scholars have pointed out. Now, I find, and I could be wrong here, but I find there is a difference of opinion, like when you mentioned, or Bart Ehrman mentioned, that the majority of, let's say, New Testament scholars do not regard the New Testament Gospels as historically accurate. I find there seems to be a difference, and maybe quite a difference, between New Testament scholars and secular archaeologists and historians. I find that the secular archaeologists are more interested in the archaeological facts, the things that they can dig up and look at. And I was personally having a conversation with Peter J. Williams at a conference in Europe a few years back, and I was under the impression that the archaeological evidence for the New Testament was quite bad, and was increasingly bad. He surprised me and gave me a reading list. But he says, no, actually, in the last number of decades, the historicity of the New Testament documents, from a purely secular analysis here. Now, keep in mind, the archaeologists have no interest on the theological claims in the New Testament. That's just. However, if you can show that it's basically historical as far as we can show, then then we could argue that, well, maybe he did actually at least do these things, set aside whether his claims are true or false, but maybe he actually did do these things. He was at these places and he did say kind of stuff like that. So I think Peter J. Williams in his latest book has done a good job of at least starting to show that it's right in the details. And if it's right in the details, and personally, if I was making stuff up, I'm not really all that concerned about, details of, this and that. Getting the frequency of name usage right wouldn't cross my mind. Rather, I would just try and build up the main story here and get something really interesting and moving. Perhaps I appeal a lot to the emotional aspect of people. They seem to be more vulnerable when it comes to what they want to believe and not. But I wouldn't worry about the details, and it seems that that's the opposite for the New Testament. Of course, I haven't proved to you or anyone else that it's historically reliable, but I do think I would make a distinction between what the New Testament scholars say and what the secular archaeology says. And I find that the New Testament scholars, I don't understand. I read their stuff and I think, man, they're like, it does seem there's some bias here compared to how they would evaluate other ancient Middle Eastern writings. It seems the bar is way higher here than for other ancient writings. And I think Peter J. Williams points out that the bar is quite a bit higher in those things. And so I asked myself, why the double standard here? What if we just use the same standard for everything? And when we do that, the New Testament starts looking pretty good in relation to other ancient historical documents at the time.
Well, what do you mean exactly? Because I know that most of the ancient historians of the time period are treated essentially in the same regard, where something like Tacitus, who's talking about the foundation of Rome and mentions Romulus and Remus being brought up by a wolf, that's not really taken seriously, even though a great deal of his works are incredibly accurate descriptions of what happened in the past. The fact that there's a large majority of what is confirmed by archaeology does not make the more miraculous claims more plausible in historiographer context. So it seems to me like they're taking the historians at the same face value and granting most of the things that we can verify and the less miraculous claims. But when it comes to those more spectacular things, they are discounted equally as much for the Gospels as they are for the other historiographers of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say you're certainly right about the supernatural claims, miraculous claims, any historical writings at all. That you're certainly right there. There's a level playing field. The level playing field is, I don't think it happened. But where I see the different is actually in the historical claims. In my reading of these New Testament scholars, it seems like the starting point is it's not true unless we can verify it. Whereas when I see other historians looking at just let's factor out all the miraculous stuff, okay? We're just talking about stuff that are historical statements. The starting point for most of the other writings that I see when I'm reading history is that, we'll accept this unless some other writing comes up contemporaneously or some other reasons to believe that it's not true. And that goes throughout all of history. I see this general, okay, it's not a miraculous claim. This is plausible. We haven't got anything else to contest here, and we'll accept that until something else comes along. Whereas in the New Testament, I'm just constantly amazed that the starting point is, I doubt any of this is true, unless we can somehow find external collaboration that it is. And we're not talking about the theological claims here. We're just talking about the historicity. And what we find when it comes to historicity is that it's under the magnifying glass. The bar is way higher for the New Testament. And what we do find is that as archaeology advances and makes more discoveries in Palestine, that we see, well, we are verifying snapshots here and a snapshot there, and it's at least the credibility of the New Testament writers is increasing, maybe not to the extent of the other ones, but there's where I see kind of a double standard. And I'm not the only one to point this out. There are some pretty prominent academics that have pointed this out. Oh, but the miracles are the sticking point, as you keep mentioning, and rightfully so. How do we deal with miraculous claims? Because we just can't believe everything. I tend to be a natural born skeptic when it comes to miraculous claims. Now, there is a bit of a problem, though, and that is repeatability. You see, anything that is basically determined by the laws of physics should be repeatable. And I think we get kind of spoilt that way because we to plan our whole lives around repeatable events and repeatable things. And let's say we can't actually repeat the exact event. Let's say that car crash on the corner of 3rd and Finch. But we can put all the known factors together and repeat a crash that really well matches what somebody claimed back there in the courtroom. Miracles, we can't do that. We can't do that in virtue of what a miracle is, and that is, it is not something that is determined by the laws of physics. If it were, it would not be a miracle, and we could repeat it any time we felt like it, provided we have enough resources at our disposal. It does not logically follow, however, that miracles cannot occur. The predicament we find ourselves in is, how do we sort through these claims of the supernatural? And we have to pull together some criteria to do that. My first initial response. It does not logically follow they don't occur, but we're left in a bad way, trying to sort through the supernatural things that are not repeatable. I want to say something about that, but let me pause right here, see if you have any particular thing you wanted me to zero in on.
Well, yeah. So I wouldn't say miracles are impossible. I would try to treat miracles as any other kinds of claims like UFO sightings or Bigfoot sightings or Loch Ness Monster sightings, which could potentially be repeatable. If they actually existed, we could actually find them and repeat the testable predictions. But it's simply the fact that we don't. That is the compelling evidence to not believe it. So simply labeling it as a miracle to say it cannot be repeated, I don't think that either adds or takes away any credibility. I think it's more the fact that if it can't be repeated, or if we don't repeat it, or if it doesn't make predictions, then we have reason not to believe it is any more than just one of those outlier claims to have been made, and we need some way to differentiate, is this an imaginary thing or is this a real thing? And for me, testable predictions is that methodology we use to be able to differentiate between those two. And I don't see a difference between a miracle claim or a mythical creature claim or magic or the UFOs or any of those kind of things. I consider all of those to be essentially equivalent.
Yeah. I think you're right in that we do need some criteria here to sort through these things, and that I would also suggest, probably you would agree, the starting point should be skepticism. We need to have some reason to believe that perhaps this is a miracle. I might start, in the case of Christ, I might start with the interesting phenomenon that it made predictions about the future. Now, as far as I'm aware, it's the only book in human history that's also for falsification that way, at least ancient book. Nowadays, everybody and his dog is making predictions. But back then, now I know that some people have pointed to Nostradamus, but I've read Nostradamus's predictions, and I suspect there's a fair amount of plagiarism going on there from Book of Revelation, for example, and from other prophecies in the Bible. So it's not as if Jesus just comes along out of the blue, completely, as if there's nothing to support any expectation of any miraculous events. It was, there were these ancient prophecies that God himself would one day be born as a little boy. That's Isaiah. And this person would be called Prince of Peace, Mighty God, Eternal Father. That there, prophecies that come ahead of, let's say let's take a look at UFOs. prophecies concerning UFOs, what a priori things would make me suspect? Well, I guess as a scientist, I could come up with a few because I think it would be surprising if there was no extraterrestrial life anywhere else. It might even be surprising if there was none of sufficient intelligence, and therefore there is a good scientific expectation, I think, for spacecraft. Now, interstellar spacecraft, there's some serious problems there, and I would be very skeptical. Even wormhole travel, I have never figured out how you could get into wormhole without being gravitationally torn to shreds. So I can see spacecraft around some other planet somewhere else, like we're doing here, but there's problems with UFOs. And I know a lot of people talk about these things, but the aggravating thing is where all these people, there should be photographs and some consistencies. So I tend to be skeptical there. Unicorns, I would have to say that Lacona does lay out a couple of criteria for a miracle, and one of them is that they cannot be reproduced by known laws of physics. That would be one. And second, they occur within what he might call, I think he calls them a religiously charged or some religious context. So you could see some, let's say, an aircraft flying through a mountain and emerge out the other side unscathed. But if it's not in a religiously charged context, you could, and I know from quantum mechanics, there is a probability you could do that, but don't sign me up to be on that flight that tries it. But so you wouldn't necessarily call that a miracle. We can have a perfectly good explanation. But if it occurred in a religiously charged atmosphere, you saw the plane approaching the mountain, you send up a prayer, God save those people, and it goes right through, then it could be a QM phenomenon, but there was a prayer. I think the probability is, I'll go with the prayer, that it was an answer to prayer, because wow, those QM probabilities are just way too small. So I would have to say I have personally witnessed about 3 miracles in my life, all of which occurred after I took first year physics and knew enough physics to say that what I am now seeing cannot be happening, but I am seeing it. And so I would just savor the moment and watch this and see what happens. All occurred within, well, they were all in emergency situations. All 3 of them, well, not all 3, one involving father. They occurred in emergency situations, and all I had time to yell was, God help me, before bad things happened. And it was then that I saw the laws of physics just completely superseded by something else. Now, that people would argue that if God exists, he can't be violating the laws of physics. But I have written software that runs on my Mac, and my Mac has an operating system, a Mac OS operating system, but I can open up a window in there, and I can run different window. And I can make this, in other words, I can interact with this computer and make it do things that were not programmed into it. I don't violate the operating system. It's just the operating system is built such that an external user can actually take steps to intervene in how that computer works and do whatever they want. We can write software that will run entirely on its own, but if the operator wants to intervene at some point, he just hits a button, and you can change the way that software, change the future direction it'll go just with a command. So I would see that the laws of physics are kind of like the software that governs the universe, but it does not preclude the writer of that software from intervening from time to time. And at the end of the day, I have seen 2 or 3 miracles occur. They were all done within a religious context in emergency situations, and I wish I could do that all the time. That would be just watch the beginning of a movie last night called, I think it was Airbender or something, but it was think it was made for children rather than adults, and I quit partway through.
Avatar the Airbender.
Avatar, that was it. Yeah, it just I just couldn't consider it was a good use of time. But my apologies, though, for those of you like Avatar. But it's the same, is that I can't write off miracles. I think there's a good case that Jesus has ancient prophecies. It does appear he did things. In fact, the academic, there does appear to be a general consensus amongst academics and religious that he at least led people to believe he could do amazing things. They're not going to say it was miracles, of course, but he could do things that people interpreted as miracles. So if you get a lot of people saying, I saw this. Now, I have been to watch illusionists work, and I watched those guys or those women, and I thought, boy, if I didn't believe in magic, I would, there's not magic happening here, but man, it sure looks like it. But the kind of miracles Jesus did, and there's extra biblical writings on some of these things later on that, state that he did do these things. But the kind of miracles like where he made blind people see and lame people walk, there's not your usual illusionist, tricks that you can learn somewhere in a guild. They're very different kind of miracles, and people lived a long time afterward. People wrote about those people. So I'd say the historical evidence, there is some that he did seem to do amazing things like heal people. Proof? No, but it's an historical case.
Well, yeah. So, but my argument is we need some way to differentiate: is this an imaginary thing or a real thing? And my way, of course, is testable predictions. And should we treat miracles? Because I grant miracles are possible. I don't have any Humean qualms about it being violations of the laws of physics. But should we take miracles as more seriously than we take UFO claims, or should we treat them the same and apply the same metric, like you mentioned earlier about the historicity? We should apply the same metric to all different criteria to try and differentiate: is this a real thing or is this a fake thing? And if we do that, what is the criteria you are using to say that the miracles in the Old Testament are reasonable to believe?
Yeah. I as a former engineer, I see everything in terms of probabilities, and so I would look at any supernatural claim in terms of how probable is this. Now, right off the bat, it's pretty hard to assign probabilities for things that are not determined by laws of physics. So I have to look at it in terms of how they're analyzed in philosophy. Like in philosophical discussions on the problem of evil, for example, you will have people like William Rowe and others use the Bayes theorem to analyze the probability that God exists. And they will try and show that it's less than 0.5, and the theists will try and show that it's greater than 0.5. And I think this is the kind of approach I would use for these supernatural claims of UFOs, unicorns, all sorts of things, miracles by whoever. I would have to rank them. And I find that a lot of these claims rank, I can't say they're zero, but they're pretty. I got no rational justification for taking them seriously. So if I have zero rational justification for taking that UFO claim seriously, or that claim, like I hear amazing things nowadays. It's just amazing what people are believing. The flat Earth, for example, the first time a fellow asked me about that, I thought he was joking, and I just laughed. I found out later, much to my embarrassment, he actually believed that. I thought, oh no, I probably offended him badly. But anyways, I rank all these supernatural claims, and I find all of them rank pretty close to zeros, because there is zero rational justification. Whereas in the case of Jesus Christ, being the Messiah and fulfilling ancient prophecies, and something amazing happened in the first century, and we're not sure what, but it is amazing. We have some rational justification. Whether it reaches a point where the probability is greater than 0.5, I kind of doubt that, and I doubt it for philosophical reasons, in that I think my reading indicates that faith is very important to God. And so you could, if you put faith, you plot it on a two-dimensional coordinate grid here. Vertical is amount of faith required, and horizontal is amount of information about that, whatever it is you're having faith in. So I just hit my cord with my
I can
thumb
hear
there,
you.
but I think I still
Yeah, I can still hear you, so you're good.
Okay, I activated. Let's turn that off. So where was I? Ranking.
Yeah, you said the resurrection is less than 5 because God has a big
Oh, I had a good
faith.
point here.
He's focused on faith.
What was the last words I said before I hit the cord with my elbow?
That God values faith. He wants faith.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Are you joking with me?
No.
Okay, he's not joking.
I'll testing.
Okay, say something.
Can you hear me now? Testing.
Say it now.
Testing. Can you
I
hear
still
me?
got nothing. Okay, let me just check my preferences here. Make sure I didn't mess something up there. I hope I did. I hit it hard enough I might actually disconnected or broke something in here. Just click preferences. Crazy. Okay, so I'm getting sound from my laptop.
Can you hear me now?
Why
Testing.
am I not getting your sound?
Probably, yeah.
Should be one and the same thing. Sound. Headphones, headphone port. Okay, I'm going to switch to my laptop sound. That doesn't make any sense while my laptop is talking to me through here, but your sound isn't.
New.
Try refreshing the page, it says.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, can you hear me now?
Ah, yes. You
All
just
right.
about blew, hold it, you're blowing my eardrums out of here because I cranked the sound away. Okay, so that did trick that refreshing of the page. Wow. Oh, and I see my my cam angle is off. My laptop is now the. There we go. Oh,
Is the volume down?
okay.
How's the volume? Should I keep talking quietly or can you?
Talk however you like.
All right, good. Didn't want to blow your eardrums out.
In terms of probability.
So
Sorry?
you mentioned that God values faith, so that the belief in the resurrection miracles.
Oh, yes, faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an important point. So if we got zero information about something, you require maximum faith, but that is a very dangerous, that's a blind leap in the dark. You could end up having faith in like a rock crystal or a fence post or, whatever. So zero information means maximum faith, but that is a very dangerous, bad kind of faith. Then you got all the information, which requires zero faith at all. So on the two-dimensional grid there, zero faith, you got zero information, you got maximum faith, all the information, you got zero faith. But if faith is so important with God, and the question is why, but if it's so important, then we have to be lacking in enough, we have to have enough information so we can at least rationally justify putting our faith in God. But not so much to render faith rather trivial. So we're caught somewhere in that window. And this is where it gets back to calculating the probability of that the miracles that Jesus performed and that he is God, or I am, as he claimed, is greater than 0.5. And this is why on the face of it, my a priori thought is it's going to be less than 0.5. because 0.5, you got a 50-50 chance of being right here. And I just think that's rather a trivial form of faith. But it's not completely irrational for the reasons I've sort of laid out.
Oh, you mentioned that you said that there's rational justification to believe in the resurrection, but the same rational justification doesn't exist for the UFOs. From my perspective, all of the evidence that indicates the resurrection, like the 500 eyewitnesses, the accounts of the Gospels, those things all seem to also exist for like UFOs and Hindu miracles and those kinds of things, where they also have the same kind of eyewitness testimony support that the Bible has. So is that the rational justification you're talking about, the eyewitness testimony and gospel accounts?
Um, it is eyewitness testimony or alleged eyewitness testimony, but not just eyewitness testimony, but testimony after the fact, talking about people that they knew had been healed or whatever. But I would distinguish that from any UFO claim I've ever seen. I mean, I know I have heard some claims where a bunch of people saw this or that, but when I read those accounts, and I used to, like back in the late 60s, I was really, wow, there's something else, because I was really into sci-fi back then, and I was hoping we would have first contact and all this kind of stuff. And I read those accounts, and, you know, it was the credibility of most of the people. Well, what reason I have here? And were they detailed accounts? Like the four Gospels are lengthy, detailed accounts. And how many people were actually there at that time? What about the opposition? In the case of, let's say, the time of Christ, that explosion of whatever it was in the occurred in Jerusalem was in the face of fierce religious opposition, yet it states that many of the religious leaders also came to faith at that time. Something happened there that I have not seen happen in the case of UFOs. I have given up reading basically UFO accounts because there was just not sufficient, what I would call testimony there by enough people of enough different varieties of credibility, or let's say occupations and so forth, to really take them seriously in this. Now, other claims to miracles, it depends when you're talking about the Hindu ones. If we're talking modern day Hindu miracles or the ancient ones, we have nothing. I mean, nothing at all external to those writings to say these actually occurred. I mean, we have lots of people who write that amazing things happened and miracles occurred all over the world. But is there any external reason to believe that something amazing did happen? I think in the case of Christ, there is a lot of external things to say something happened in the first century in Jerusalem.
Right, I was talking about like the modern ones, like Santi Sai Baba, where he had thousands of people around him and he performed miracles, and they all had eyewitness testimonies, lots of different backgrounds, doctors to all the different caste systems in India. They were all there witnessing it. So they had detailed accounts, lots of eyewitnesses, lots of historical accounts of newspapers and people who all verify that he existed. We have pictures of him on Wikipedia, so we have a pretty good basis of evidence of those things.
Okay, well, the newspaper accounts I tend to just throw in the garbage, but I am interested. I have not heard of this. I'm interested in those, if there were actually doctors present, and were those doctors devotees of this person or not? And what kind of miracles were they? Did he actually make people walk, or was it kind of an illusionist type of thing, which for all purposes, they certainly look like miracles to me, although I know they're not. So there has to be some way of, but I would rank that, okay, given what you said, I would say, okay, let's say there are doctors present and there were a lot of people witness this. A lot of people witness this doesn't carry any weight with me if they're illusionist type of tricks. Because you can have illusionists in front of thousands of people and they'll all swear that this was amazing. But we know it's a trick because there's, afterwards, and this is the main thing, there's not a lame person who now is walking around with perfectly good legs. So I assume it's a trick that he learned from the guild. So I would say, okay, if he actually made people better in ways that can be verified both before and after, then okay, we got something interesting here. I'd like to check that out because it's now no longer at the zero rational justification level, it's slightly higher. Having said that, Jesus seemed to say some interesting things said from time to time. He suggests that a human being is capable of vastly more than what we actually suspect. He said things like, if you had faith as a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would be done. Now, I wish I could do that because I have some real landscaping things I would like to do with that ability. But I have to say, the only miracles I've ever seen were in emergency situations where I just says, God help me, and this has to happen right now, or I'm toast, or there's serious problems. But in normal everyday life, but my point is this, is that he did seem to think that in fact, he seemed to think anybody can do miracles. And I'm thinking, well, what are we missing here if that's the case? And if that is true, if what he said is true, it would not surprise me in the least if miracles occur in other areas of the world, because he seemed to think that's not the only way he'll know for sure. But what I'm saying is true. He sold to us is that I'm going to rise from the dead. The miracles, he seemed to think anybody can do that. So it wouldn't surprise me if what he said is true, if these do occur, although he also seemed to claim that there's two sources of supernatural power, and one is good and one is not so good at all. And so that would be the next question I would have, is I would like to look in if they actually occurred somewhere else. But at this point, I'll raise my rational justification for what you told me from pretty much zero rational up to maybe a little higher, but I would have to check it out. I have checked out Jesus of Nazareth, of course, and a lot of things surrounding that, but not what you mentioned to me.
All right,
I'm not sure.
Go ahead.
I guess the main thing we're talking about is some sort of way of sorting through all sorts of miraculous claims. So for them, I just start at zero rational justification for all of them, and then see if there's anything going for any of them. There is a philosopher who does a philosophical analysis of some actual miracles that he checked into. I found he's very academic and it's very dry reading, but he comes to the conclusion that they probably do happen, given the ones he specifically was able to interview people to check out and so forth, but probably is not proof.
Is that like Gary Habermas?
No. He's a Canadian philosopher out on the West Coast. A German last name. Of course, Habermas sounds a bit German to me. I'm not sure if that is or not, but no, totally. I've got his book. I read it, but it's been a few years back now.
Oh, there's because there's Gary Habermas and then the guy who did a bunch of miracle research. Oh, I remember him too because I read his book. I think
You're talking J.P. Moreland?
Not J.P. Moreland. There was another guy who did like 1,000 miracle claims all around the world, medical documents.
Never heard of it.
Oh, I've lost in my head, but I do know of him. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, we've talked a lot about the historicity, but we haven't mentioned the moral argument at all. Want to transition to that real quick?
Yeah, real quick. Okay. Okay, this one here is really an appeal to how seriously you're going to take your moral intuitions. So it's not going to be a, how would you say it? This one is going to be, well, let me just start. And, it's certainly not going to be a proof, but yet I think it seems to have a fair amount of power emotionally. So there's nothing wrong with appealing to emotions. And let me just say this, that if in fact we do have a soul, then I would think it's surprising, and that soul is what defines us, then it would be surprising if our soul does not have any perceptive ability itself. In other words, all we got is our five physical senses, and the soul can perceive things we don't. So what I'm really going to do here, Tom, is appeal to your soul. So here it goes. And it kind of follows C.S. Lewis's pattern in his book, New Christianity, but he starts by observing that people tend to have discussions which actually make no sense unless there's some sort of common moral ground. They might say, well, that's cheating, or that's not fair. And they will argue about whether it was cheating or whether it was fair, but they both seem to assume that cheating is not good or being fair is good. So there seems to be some moral intuitions that we hold, that Lewis argues that we may argue about some of the details on these things, but there's some serious common ground across all civilizations, or most civilizations, ethnic groups throughout history. So he appeals to these moral intuitions. Now, I would then we have a whole pile of objections immediately. Well, could they be a social construct, for example? Could we just have, is it some sort of unwritten social contract whereby we can all get along together? And we can certainly come up with social contracts, and we can certainly draft moral codes in our society. We don't usually call them necessarily moral codes, but a code of ethics, and we even put them into law. For example, I would say in Canada here, our government operates according to the contractarian view of ethics, with the dash of utilitarianism thrown in. But there is a problem, Lewis points out, with that, in that we think that some cultures are better than other cultures. In other words, let's say the social contract that they might have in that country is better than the social contract they have over there. And so while we acknowledge that both countries can and do draft their own code of ethics, some of those codes of ethics come nearer to a higher universal standard than others do, and that gives us the grounds for saying that our system of ethics here in Canada is better than the system of ethics they have over there in, say, North Korea, to pick on North Korea. And I don't think there'll be too many defenders of North Korea's code of ethics here watching your program. So the moment we do that, we're granting that we can make up a code of ethics, but we're also appealing to a higher standard of ethics. And ultimately, when we start talking like that, we're talking nonsense unless there actually is some universal code of moral rules or laws that transcend not just individual countries and individuals within those countries, but even transcend history, so we can look back in history and say, well, that culture over there was better than this culture over here at a different time and place. So does that prove that such a standard exists or not? And the answer is no. It just tells us that we act as if there is, and it brings us to a crisis point. The crisis point is this: are we going to acknowledge that we're all talking nonsense here? Or are we just going to become subjective, and it's going to be whoever moral code wins out in the end, or whoever we get to impose our moral code? We tend to judge other countries by our own moral codes. Like we think, Canada is the best, or the US is the best. Although it depends what you're looking at in the US. But, we all tend to do that. Or my moral code's better than that person over there. However, let's take this seriously. Let's say there is a moral code that seems to transcend humanity. Would it work if aliens invaded us and decided that, they have a really good moral code, except for point number 57B, which suggests that humans are excellent fertilizer for their crops, and they just start harvesting us? Well, we would say, you guys got a pretty good moral code here, but that point number right there, I think there's a problem with that, and immediately we're assuming there is a moral code even higher than humanity that transcends not only humanity but also the universe. So we can say to any we can meet with other alien races and have discussions about which is better, which is more moral, ethical. We can complain about that race over there on that planet. They're doing bad things. So let's take that seriously, and I'm appealing to person's intuition and feelings here. So what would be the cause of that? So the first thing I observe is that this ultimate system of morality is only useful to minds capable of moral deliberation, not useful to fence posts and rocks and things like that. So if I was to explain where did this come from, I would say if it's only useful to minds capable of moral deliberation, then chances are it comes from a mind that has an appreciation for morality and is capable of moral judgments and so forth. That would be one inference I would draw from that. In the same sense, if I found a piece of paper on the sidewalk with a recipe for chocolate cake and had to come up with an explanation for where did this recipe come from, I would say a good explanation that came from someone with an appreciation for chocolate cake. Same goes for this universal moral principle and the ability to perform moral deliberation. So it's only useful to minds capable of moral deliberation. Secondly, it's only useful to minds that have free will. And why I say that is, and free will as I defined, I think maybe in our last discussion, is the ability to make decisions that are not determined by any antecedent conditions outside of my own mind. And secondly, I could have decided otherwise. A moral law is only useful to minds that I can actually make decisions about it. So if all my behavior is determined, moral law is kind of useless to me. Like gravity, for example, is not that useful to minds. Well, let me rephrase that. It's handy to know about those things if I go to step off a cliff, but I can't make much decision about whether, I'm going to obey the moral law or not. I can decide not to, but the gravity is just going to step in the moment I step off that cliff. Whereas this here, I can actually choose whether to do it or not. So the best explanation, I would think, or I would suggest for the origin of this ultimate moral standard is that it too is a mind that has free will. It is a free agent. So we have a free agent mind that is capable of moral deliberation. But you and I would argue, or I would suggest at least, satisfy those qualities. So what is it about that mind that is better than your mind or mind? Because we argue amongst ourselves maybe about what's better and what's more just. So ultimately we have to have, so let's say we had a bunch of amazing minds from somewhere show up, and we had to figure out which one is the standard. And we would notice that some minds are more perfect, or they're not all perfect, but they're better than others. We could say, well, that is truly an amazing mind. They think of things we never thought of, and it's just jaw-droppingly good, except I do think that one over there is even better. And the moment you say that, you're comparing it with some, and basically what we arrive at is the standard of perfection. We don't maybe know what perfection is, but we know that it will have to be perfect in justice, perfectly beautiful, perfectly good, perfectly just. The philosopher Alvin Planck would define such a being as maximally excellent, that degree of excellence beyond which it is not logically possible to be more excellent. And so at the end of the day, if we're going to grant that there is a universal law that transcends all things, and that there is no better law out there, or it comes from, basically we have to compare it with a maximally excellent mind, in which case we have an argument for the existence of a maximally great being, as Planck also defines, that degree of greatness beyond which is not logically possibly greater. So I could think of a couple of objections, but perhaps I should pause here and let you throw one or two on the table.
Right. So I definitely believe in objective morality, and most philosophers are more realists, even though they are also, most philosophers are atheists. But I think that morality could be grounded in just like a law of nature. I don't think it's required to have a mind. Like we know that certain laws only affect certain kinds of things, like electromagnetism only affects certain kinds of things that have an electromagnetic field. That doesn't mean that and electromagnetism is grounded in a thing with an electromagnetic field. It just is the electromagnetic field. So I don't think that saying that morality is useful for minds indicates that it comes from a mind. It could just apply to minds. Like many laws are applied to certain emergent things that don't apply to others. Like gravity is a force that only applies to certain things that have a large amount of mass. So protons and electrons are unaffected by gravity essentially. But that doesn't mean that gravity is made of things with large mass. It just affects things with large mass. So I think that there could be a law of nature that is moral, that affects minds, and not necessarily be grounded in a mind.
Excellent. I'm very interested in that. I do encounter philosophers from time to time who hold that, and I'd like to find out more about this. But okay, just a couple of things immediately come to mind, like the things you suggested for physics. If we want to know more about those things, we consult the physicists. Now, if the law, if morality, if this sort of, if objective morality is actually a law of nature, and when I talk about law of nature, I don't see any distinction between laws of physics and the laws of nature. I would hold they're one and the same.
Right, I agree.
But if it is, then we should be consulting the physicists. The physicists, let's say in their particle accelerators, whatever, should be the ones who are discovering these moral laws. So what would you respond to that? What would you say?
Well, I would respond to it the same way I would respond to Einstein when he said time physically bends. I mean, philosophers used to say, well, if time physically bends, we'd be able to like measure that, right? That we would concern that with the physicists, but we can't actually do that. We can't measure time. Time is just a constant of the universe. But then later we discovered, oh wait, actually we can measure this. It is a thing in physics. We just didn't know about it at the time. So I think that ideas like morality, which we seem to be purely philosophical concepts that don't have a physical correlate, may be discovered to have a physical correlate, just like we discovered time does. And it's not actually a purely philosophical concept. So it doesn't seem to be a contradiction that we haven't discovered a physical way to measure it yet. And we could discover it in the future, just like we did for time bending.
Okay. Now, let me just clarify one thing with you. From what you've said thus far, I think I could rule out the possibility that you are a Platonist when it comes to moral realism. Okay.
Right, correct.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I mean, at least that helps clarify things a little bit. Okay, it is possible. Okay, you've raised a possibility that actually it will be the physicists who ultimately will discover these moral laws. And not sure how we'll draft those mathematically as usual or some other way, but it is maybe mathematics is too simple of a way to describe everything, and maybe we'll discover a better way to describe these moral laws. So a fascinating possibility. I will grant that. But there seems to be a difference between these moral laws and, let's say, all the other laws you talked about, law of gravity, electromagnetism and stuff. And that is, there doesn't seem to be any choice whatsoever as to whether or not we will obey the law of gravity, or if have a charge about us that we will not incur the effects of a magnetic field. We have, excuse me. We don't have any choice whatsoever. We cannot violate those laws. And I would use violate as we can't decide, hey, I don't think I'm going to comply with the law of gravity today. But we do seem to be able to violate moral principles. We can do things that are terribly unjust and what we might call evil. So it seems that this theory that moral laws are actually just part of the physics of the universe, there's a problem right there in that everything in physics has no choice about it as whether we'll obey that or not. But these do seem to have a choice. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say the same thing that we do about gravity, that given enough force, we can overcome gravity to some degree and move away from the planet. And I think the same thing applies to morality, is that it's not that we're like breaking the law when we do immoral things, is that just we're just overcoming it. It's like we have a drive to do moral things, but we can, of course, given enough force, essentially, we can do the immoral things. And so it's simply a mathematical description of where we fall on that moral scale. If you do an immoral action, you're just being immoral. Just like if you use a rocket ship, you're moving away from something of a large mass of gravity and decreasing the mass of the Earth, essentially. So I'd say we're still under the effects of morality, just like we're under the effects of gravity, but it's just a weaker force. It doesn't force us like the strong nuclear force is, where we just can't escape it no matter what we do. It's more like the gravitational force, where it's weak enough that we can move away from it given the correct force applied.
Okay. Yeah. I think you clarified that we don't actually violate the law of gravity when we fly or take off in a spacecraft. We always have to work within it and its constraints. But if it's weak enough, or if we have a force that's even stronger, then we are able to do things we could not do if just sitting there in a gravitational field, for example. So the question is this moral? Are these moral laws physical? And could it be that we are influenced by them, but not so heavily as to determine our decisions? That does raise questions about how our brain works, because if you are a materialist, everything in your brain is electrons and electromagnetic fields, chemical processes, which are entirely determined by the laws of physics. So I'd be curious to wonder how that it's actually physics, a situation, but let's suppose that's somehow possible. There is still another issue I can see, and the issue is that if what you are saying is correct, then we should be able to observe the effects of these moral laws from birth, from infancy on. They should be natural, in other words. We should just be able to raise children without influencing with their own teachings. They should just grow up to hold these principles because they're actually a field. There is a moral field within the universe that is influencing them all the time. In reality, having had 6 children, what I observe is that we never had to teach them how to lie, how to hit each other, how to fight, how to take each other's things. That was just completely natural. They just behaved, sorry to say, like animals. There would be a pecking order, and eventually turn out that it would be probably the strongest, most adept liar who could enforce their will on everybody else would be the winner. What we had to do instead is that we had to work very hard to teach them not to lie, not to take each other's toys, we had to teach them the opposite of what they were naturally inclined to do. And here is one of the very few things I agree with when Richard Dawkins gives his philosophical views on stuff. And he says, you won't find morality in genetics. He says we have to teach it. And so I never had to teach my kids about gravitational fields and electromagnetic fields and the speed of light and so forth, and aging. Those things will happen to them with zero teaching. Now, it's good that they know about those things, and I want my children to understand the way the universe works. But they will comply regardless, whether they know it or not. But I have to teach them the opposite of what they were naturally inclined to do. So if I were to sum it up in a syllogism, let me make one up off the top of my head here. If the moral laws exist as a moral field within the universe, and we should naturally be inclined to do them, and we should be able to observe this in people before we put our own influence in them, like our own religious and moral teachings and political views and which hockey team is the best and so forth. We should be able to observe that very early on before they are polluted by the adults, so to speak. But we don't. We observe the opposite. Therefore, I would conclude that it's unlikely that there is a moral field within this universe that is due to physics. Now, I just thought through a couple of good objections to holding any kind of moral absolutes at all from my argument, but I won't mention them unless you do.
Okay, right. So
Actually,
my response to that would be is that like many forces like gravity don't affect things like protons and electrons because they're too small. But as you gain mass, you start to be more affected by gravity and you start to notice it. And I'd say the moral law would be kind of like that: is that it's super weak for things like ants or insects or children, where if you don't have the cognitive capacity, you don't really recognize it's there, and you need to have essentially a bigger brain, just like a bigger mass to understand gravity, because it's not strong enough to be apparent. And as we gain more intellectual capacity, then this force will become stronger and stronger. We'll be more susceptible to it. So the reason we
mhm.
don't see it affecting children is the same reason we don't see a gravity affecting protons. It doesn't affect things at that order of magnitude. We need a greater order of magnitude for it to be noticeable, which is why I think for humans it would be explainable why we are so immoral, because we've just started to recognize this immoral thing as a part of society as primates and social mammals.
Yeah. Okay. So to summarize what you're saying, the moral field may exist, but it needs in order to, but it affects primarily, but it's but it's basically our mental development, our cognitive abilities is what it influences, which unfortunately go back to electrons, electric fields, and so forth. So I think there might still be a problem there, but perhaps we could get out of that by saying once you get sufficient interactions within the neural network, so there is a substantial amount of cognitive processes taking place, then it becomes more susceptible to the moral field. Okay, so that's a live possibility. Let's grant that it's a live possibility. Um, there is see one of the predicament I'm finding myself in is that actually believe in Romans chapter 2, where it says that God has put the moral law within every human being, so that you don't actually need to believe in God to know what's right and wrong. And so there is this influence here, you see. So what I have to argue, it's this very knife edge problem that I'm on here, is I have to concede that there is a moral influence on us. And in fact, we observe that all over the place. I have to concede that, but I want to argue that it's not laws of physics. It's rather working on a metaphysical level, something, let's say it's working on a level of the soul and the supernatural aspect of things. And that's the difficulty I find myself in at the moment. So how would I get out of that? Too bad my coffee cup's empty. At this point, I would take a swig. Um, okay, here's one approach. And I'm not going to necessarily get out of this dilemma here, but it would point to a possible way of getting out of it. One would be to see which has the greater explanatory power. Is there a moral code that exists that is simply a physical field within the universe that operates on a significant level of cognitive processes? Or is this moral law on the level of the soul? Or as I said last time, but for the sake of people this time who hadn't seen last time, I would distinguish between the brain and the mind. So it operates on the level of the mind. So we would have to look at the two explanations and then see which has the greater explanatory power, which runs into the more difficulty. And if I were to suggest a difficulty with the physical view, it still seems to me that somehow this moral field should be detectable, physically detectable, if it's going to, you see, it has to act on electrons and chemical processes if our brain is completely material. That being the case, it seems to me it has to be physically and or electrically, it has to be somehow detectable from physics. And so I would say it's an interesting theory, but until someone can actually say, okay, we didn't just make this up, but now we can actually do this physics experiment and detect an influence here that is not electromagnetic. Is it electromagnetic? It can't be just strictly electromagnetic because it's forcing us in the direction of justice and goodness and beauty.
Right. I try to tie it into like information theory in some way. That's some undiscovered property of nature and matter that's instantiated in information, something like that.
Well, that's another topic we could talk about because I would argue that the ability to produce statistically significant levels of information is unique to minds. It will not happen in nature.
Well, I would
But
just go
that
with
is a
physics. I
whole nother
mean,
discussion.
the Leonard Susskind's holographic principle, where anything that falls into a black hole, the information is retained on the black hole. So everything is information. But yeah, that's a different topic.
Totally different because it's also fascinating with me, and there would be a substantial amount I could say on that.
Oh, but
So
I did want to pick up on where you the explanatory power, because from my perspective, the natural law has more explanatory power than the theistic one, specifically due to something like the problem of suffering. Like saying it's a law that just exists on a spectrum that can only affect things on a certain point on the spectrum to some degree seems to make sense out of why there's evil as opposed to a God who's just all powerful and could just make it, and the fact that there is so much evil and suffering in the world. It seems like the God hypothesis does not have very much explanatory power, and the free will defense seems very ad hoc from my perspective as a solution to this problem.
I wouldn't say it's totally ad hoc, and I would go back to our earlier discussion, which I suppose people can view, where we both seemed to agree at that time, at least, that the space-time matter and energy seemed to have a beginning in the past, and there was this something out there which we might call an essence, but where we differed was that I suggested this essence has a mind. You did not grant that. But if we at least agree that there is an essence out there that is the origin of space-time matter and energy, whether it has a mind or not, we then have a non-ad hoc, we then have a legit reason to say that maybe these moral laws reside in that essence rather than the space, time, matter, and energy is interaction. And it could be that is why we have not been able to detect it yet, at least yet, with its interaction on electrons and chemical processes, which we should do. We could also draft a prediction based on the theory that moral laws are part of the physical universe, or there's this moral field, and the prediction would be that we should be able to detect its interaction on electrons and electromagnetic processes and chemical processes. It's going to be interact with the material mind. Now, it could be the case, like we're looking for gravitational waves, for example, from the period of inflation, and as we build more sensitive equipment, we're starting to detect gravitational waves from collisions of other objects in the galaxy. But we still have not detected these supposedly substantial gravitational waves from the period of inflation. So the question is, look like we might have to rework the inflation aspect of things or rework something else. But at that point, a prediction is very good. So we have the candidate here that's very similar to gravitational waves, and we're talking about moral fields. And the prediction is we should be able to detect that. But until we can, and thus far we've detected zero, nothing in the way of a moral field influencing that. We have, I don't think, any rational justification to grant that hypothesis. We'll have to wait and see. So I don't see I would see, thus far it looks like it's falsified, in the sense that the gravitational waves from inflation might be falsified, but we can't say it for sure either are falsified. It's just that but we do have an explanation for the origin of moral laws that is independent of space-time matter and energy, and that would go back to are mutually granted essence, although we disagree on whether it has a mind or not. But if it did have a mind, that would explain some things. It would explain why minds in this universe and why our minds seem to be able to perceive things that our physics experiments can't. You see, I would think it should be quite easy to detect this moral field because it works on all of our brains all the time, pretty much. So it should be quite detectable. Anyways, I'm just rambling on here.
Well, so the mention about being falsified, from my perspective, the problem of suffering makes the high theist hypothesis seem very falsified. What is your take on that? The problem of suffering.
That's a huge question and a big and a deep one.
Oh, last time you mentioned
I
that
did a
the
whole
logical problem of suffering isn't, you don't think that, you think that one's been defeated, and I have a version that I like a lot.
Yeah, Planaga. I think the general consensus, and I wouldn't say the unanimous consensus, but the general consensus in the field of philosophy is that Planaga's free will defense actually defeated the logical problem of evil. And the logical problem is that it's simply logically impossible to have both a God who's all powerful, all knowing, and good, and stuff happening that is not good. Because if he was those three things, he'd either stop it, maybe he doesn't know about it, he doesn't have the power to do so, or he's not perfectly good. But if that's the case, then it's logically impossible for God to exist. But Planaga introduced, but what if? What if there are free agents in the world? And these free agents don't actually see the state of any world at time t, if there's no free agents, is entirely determined by God. If God actually launches that world, the initial conditions and so forth, the boundary conditions, the laws. So it's entirely determined by God. But if that world contains free agents who make decisions that are not determined by antecedent conditions, then the state of the world at any time t is determined by two things: the all the laws of nature and stuff that are running the environment and everything else, and the decisions of free agents. And it may be possible, argued Planaga, that there is no world, that there are many possible worlds in which the free agents always freely cooperate all the time with God. But in reality, pragmatically, there is no actualizable world where they actually do that. In every case where you actualize the world with free agents, at least some of them will choose wrongly. And how do we know, says Planaga, that this isn't such a world? And that showed that it's logically possible to have the evil and suffering we see in this world and have a God with those three attributes. There still remains, however, the evidential problem of arguments against God. And those arguments are what I focused on in my master's program. I actually did a whole master's degree focusing on this.
Oh, actually, I'd like to pick up on the logical one because I have a version of the logical one I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Let's hear it.
So my version is that God is a morally perfect being, so he has to do the morally perfect action to the best of his ability, which may include free will. But we can say that this world isn't the morally perfect one because there's a better option, which is that even if we have free will, God could have given each of us the option to be in this world of his design with Jesus and suffering and all of the free agents interacting as they do. Or we could have had the option to go to a world of our own design. Say, I'm not really a big fan of this one. I just like to go to my own world. So we still have free will. We still have sin. We still have all of the benefits of this world. It just becomes optional. We can go to this world or we can go to a different one. And that world seems to be a logically possible one God could have instantiated. And it would be morally superior to this one, which means since it's not instantiated, God can't be morally perfect. Because there is a more moral option out there, which is just make this world that we're in optional for everyone. You can choose to go to this one, or you can choose to go to a different one, and that is a morally superior world than forcing us to be in this one without our consent.
Well, see, maybe a couple of issues come up. And one of the issues is, what is the point of our existence? Is the point of our existence simply to be happy all the time? Is that the point? or is there some greater reason why God has brought us into existence? That would be doesn't refute what you say, but it is relevant to, let's all choose this world over here, which is basically a five-star resort all the time. That's an issue we would need to look at, because if the point of our existence is actually defeated by such a world, then such a world would actually turn out to be a bad world. I mean, we all had a great time. Nobody hurt anybody. It was a fantastic vacation, and we never died. It just went on and on. And I was happy all the time. But there's a second issue that I think we would also be relevant in that. I'd probably choose that other world, assuming I had never thought about the higher question. I might want to I'd ask a few questions, first of all, about door number 1 and door number 2. I would say, well, what is the point? What's the game here? What is the reason for these doors and for my existing? Because I want to know that I want to pick the world where I will achieve the purpose for which I exist. Maybe the long-term gain for the short-term pain, if that's necessary. Otherwise, sign me up for the five-star vacation. But the problem I have, and I just say it knowing my own self, the moment I got into that world, it wouldn't be perfect anymore, because I just can't see myself. I just can't see myself doing the right thing all the time. Okay, I mean, it's not like I've only sinned once or twice in my life, and if I just worked really hard, I might have not done those things. I think I've talked to a lot of university students, atheist, agnostic, really, whatever. I asked them, have you ever done anything that you thought was wrong? I have asked that of hundreds and hundreds of individual students, because I like to. All of them except one said yes, and that one at a pretty low bar. So how we I just don't see, practically speaking, that you could put us in the best of all possible worlds, and next thing you know, people are going to be lobbying for this and that, and some guys are going to be, there's going to be two problems, I'd imagine. There's going to be people are just bad attitudes. Even in that world, you'd have to have a good attitude. Like, see, in my world, in my thinking, not my world, but in my thinking, if you have two men and they always do the right thing all the time, let's say two husbands do the right thing all the time. One husband is continually lusting after all sorts of women, but never actually does anything about it. And the other one doesn't do that, just devoted in his heart and mind to his wife. Which is the better man? Well, I commend both of them, for especially the guy who's always lusting after the other woman, for not actually following up on that. But my vote goes with a guy who's totally devoted to his wife, who only loves her and is faithful to her, not only in deed, but in his heart and soul. And so in that world, I would suggest we all have to have the right attitude. That's even harder. I can't see it happening. Something has to happen, therefore. There has to be some sort of a world. Like, I remember when I first got this game called Mech Warrior.
Oh, I love that game. It's such a good game.
Yeah, I blew all sorts of time on that game, to the point where I would say I sinned. I will confess that. And I eventually swore off it, and swore off computer games in general because of becoming an addict. But before you could play Mech Warrior, you had to do this training stuff. You have to go into this arena, so to speak, this level where you train, and it prepares you for becoming a true Mech Warrior. I would suggest that, given my propensity for having a bad attitude and for sinning all the time, somehow I would have to be put into a world that's a training ground, where I make wrong decisions. I begin to see and actually reap the consequences of my wrong decisions. And over the course of time, I realize I do not like this. I do not want this forever. Please don't put me in a five-star resort that lasts forever, because over time, I will get more and more brilliant all the time at doing bad things and who knows what sort of horror movies we'll be having 10 billion years into the future. So I see this world as a training ground that you determine your eternal fate. It's really, we don't accomplish our purpose in this life, we only begin it, and we basically make choices either way.
So my response would be the first one is I think it's morally better to be given the option to adopt the purpose and then choose to do so rather than being having the purpose forced on you without your consent. So the first objection you had, well, if this world invalidates our purpose, that would make it a worse world. Well, I think if it's an option, I think that actually makes it a better world because, like you said about the two men, the one who lusts after his wife, lusts after everyone but doesn't do anything, versus the one who's purely a good person and chooses to be a good person. I think the given the option to fulfill your purpose and go to the world God designed for us would be morally superior than being forced into it without your consent. And secondly, I think in this world I'm imagining, everyone gets the option to go to their own planet. So you get your own world, your own little universe, which there's no interacting if you don't have to. You could, of course, go to a joint one and be with other people with other rules, which all the good and the bad that comes with it. But the only difference is that it's optional. You can still do everything in this world is possible in that world. You can choose to be with the people you like, or in a group community with good rules or bad rules, or you can choose to be in God's world as He designed it. So it seems like you can still do everything good and bad in this world. The only difference is that it becomes optional. You can choose to participate in all of the good and bad, or you can choose to go to a universe all by yourself alone. Just like, nope, I want nothing to do with any of them. And you can choose to leave if you want, choose to join someone else's world later if you get bored with it or whatever. It seems like in this world, you get everything you have in the earth that God designed. The only difference is that it becomes optional, voluntary, which seems to make it morally superior than being forced into it without our consent.
Well, I really like that own personal planet idea, except I would rather have the entire galaxy. There's lots of them out there, okay? So I think we can divvy them up. I dream about that literally. I thought, I'm in the wilderness where I see something gorgeous in nature, and I know that just over the horizon there is Toronto, and to me, Toronto is just the armpit of Canada. And so it spoils the experience. If I could go to a galaxy somewhere, and this was all mine, and it was unspoiled beauty, and I'd make some personal rules like no pollution, none of this stuff at all. I love that, and it's one of my dreams for maybe what eternity is like. Like God says He's going to create a new cosmos, and I dream about that. However, okay, back to reality though. So I do see here, you're suggesting that a person can choose, they're looking at the doors, the options, and let the guy like me say, now, what is the purpose of this whole deal? And let's say God tells you what the purpose is, and then you get to choose whether you want to go for that purpose or not. And if you don't want to, off you go to this 5-star resort for all eternity. Okay, I think I can argue that you're becoming, what you're presenting here is actually converging on what I perceived reality to be. So there's a lot of people who would choose, no, I don't want that option, especially the pain and suffering back here. And I know that humans, they tend to think rather short term. It's just a phenomenon about us. The long term, it's really quite pathetic, actually, about how lack of long term thinking we do. But so I would imagine a lot of people will sign up for the 5-star resort. It's good that they actually got to choose. But what I would say, and I would say it on the basis of empirical evidence here, is that 5-star resort would eventually turn into a hell beyond even our capability to imagine. And the reason is, excuse me, that you would be filled with everybody, maybe with I don't think everybody has 100% good intentions, but be filled with normal people like myself. I don't want to paint myself as a serious reprobate here. I'm just a normal person, and by comparing myself with other people, I'm a decent guy, as most people are. But if I could live in a 5-star resort, and part of that is do whatever I want to, and if I can't do whatever I want to, I would begin to see that's a bit of a problem here, because I would really prefer to do this thing over here, and it's not by somebody's definition a good thing. And can you imagine? Like I can imagine, and I don't even want to go there. I would become after 10 million years with no. I need God's help. In other words, I very much depend on God to change me over the course of my life, to work within me, to make me the kind of person He created me to be. Otherwise, I would see there is no point to this existence. I mean, I can have a lot of fun, yep, but basically, and there really is nothing actually wrong with what I want to do over here, as long as I don't get caught. I'd be a pragmatist. I think pragmatism would begin to rule at that 5-star resort eventually. It's what you could get away with. And then the powerful, you see, it's never equal. It's never equal in this world. There always will be. And again, this is based on empirical observation. There will always be somebody who's more powerful, there will be it's not going to be an egalitarian world, and the powerful begin to impose their will on the other people in that 5-star resort. Eventually, I can see this place turning into a living hell. I mean, I got a good imagination, and some of those horror movies are pretty bad, but they're just, I mean, we haven't lived long enough. I can imagine that in 10 million years, we'll be able to come up with even far worse horror movies than we dream of today because we haven't had enough time to imagine things yet. So I grant I understand, but I see that there's an empirical problem with how humans behave. And it
Well, I mean,
seems that
apologies just to
all of us,
interrupt, but from my perspective, in this idea, everybody gets their own universe, like you said, like their own galaxy, and you can
mhm,
choose to be like, well, wall it off and say this is just mine, stay away, no one else can come in. And so everyone does have that essentially that egalitarian freedom of
okay.
everybody gets their own universe. And some people can choose to be a part of other people's universes who may be good or bad, and they can always just choose to go back to their own universe or start a universe with people they trust with set rules or whatever. But it's in that sense it is egalitarian where everyone gets their own universe and they can just be alone and not participate in those senses. So it wouldn't necessarily fall into that hellhole that you're imagining because you can just go to your own universe and be alone and just I'm not gonna you can't touch me there, go away. That
Hmm.
freedom I think is morally better than being forced to live in a world like here where you have to cooperate with the good and the bad together
Hmm.
without choosing it.
Yeah. I also lived long enough to know that people aren't all like me. Like I love solitude, but I don't want it all the time. I love my family and close friends. So I'm not sure that everybody would be entirely comfortable having their own universe. But as you say, they could always invite people over for, a time. And eventually, I think if you and I worked hard enough at it, you see, we're not just we're not just islands. We seem to be built to actually have even more fulfillment when we have love and interaction with other people. In fact, I would say the older I get, the more important relationships have become to me. They were not so important when I was young, never thought much about them. But the older I get, they have now become the most important thing in my life is relationships. So eventually, if you and I put our heads together, we would come up, okay, let's have a universe where we do have relationships and everything is perfect all the time and we don't have this hell that Kirk talked about over there. But I think what you're beginning to describe is precisely what God has in mind. The question is, how do we get there? And I would suggest that this world has to take place in order so, and I could come up with some reasons why. So we become so, here's one idea, and it's one that's occurred to me a lot, is we become so fed up with evil and injustice and our own propensity to do things that eventually I have to throw myself in the hands of God and say, God, change me because I don't want to go, I don't want to last forever in this state that I am. And this is what he actually promises as a part of being spiritually reborn. So in this life, I can actually experience a spiritual rebirth. He says also in this life, you'll have the old nature, the way you were born, but that goes when you pass into the future, into the final world. So something has to happen. And the question would be you and I, we would talk about, you probably have some sort of plan on to get to this ideal universe. But I think what you have in mind and what you want is what we both want. And I think if we all talked about this enough with enough people, we all want this sort of thing, a world that was beautiful beyond our imagining, never ending. But the question is, what has to happen to get that kind of world? And this is where maybe you and I come from, have a different plan. And my plan is I need supernatural help, and I'm actually experiencing that. I experience it's the most fulfilling thing is my relationship with God and my awareness of his presence and what he's doing within me. It's just made beauty come even more up to another whole level of magnitude, and my thirst and enjoyment for justice, while at the same time becoming increasingly appalled at some of the natural ways, my natural capabilities, which I am so looking forward to leaving behind and entering that world. So it seems we do have a common ground, and actually maybe not a common ground, but a common desire. It's just how would we get there?
Right, and I'm just thinking about it like that Bible story where I forget the prodigal son asks for his inheritance early and just goes off and spends it, and then comes back at the end. I kind of see it like that. I think it would be morally superior to give us the right to option to design our own world, realize it's terrible, and then come back and decide to go to God's world as he designed it to go through this learning process. I think that would be morally superior, just like in the Bible story, as opposed to just forcing us to go through this suffering without our consent initially.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, what you've actually covers that. What you've that class of things you've described. You've described a possible world, or basically maybe a set of worlds. You've described a possible world that you believe is morally superior to this one. But Plantinga also argues that if, in fact, God exists and has those three attributes, then it logically follows from that the world we're actually in is the best of all possible worlds. That is, he would have considered your suggestion before the dawn of time. And in light of the objective of creating us in the first place. And then here we are. So this world here, we can conceive, all of us, and Plantinga admits it, all of us can conceive of better possible worlds. It's just whether or not they're actualizable given the propensity of human nature, and what's the fastest and best way to actually achieve the world you and I both would like to live in with the least amount of pain and suffering. So Plantinga argues that this world here would be the one if God exists. And of course, that's the big if. But if he does exist, then we actually living in the best of all possible worlds.
Right, like the Leibnizian argument that this is the best of all possible worlds. And I think it's wrong. I think I disagree. I think here's a better one. All you have to do is just make this world optional, and then you get a better world. That's all you need. Add one thing to this world, you can make it better. Just make it optional.
Yeah, and I understand. It certainly sounds a good idea to me. And really, I think we then are faced with, well, does God actually exist or not? And we're back to that question. And even then, it's just an academic question if he has not intervened within history. Because if he hasn't, then it's just an academic discussion. But if he has, and what Christ says is true, there is that world coming, where there is this option that we have as to which ultimate world we live in. One that ultimately is evil unleashed, or where there is zero of that happening. And the big question is, and this is where I concede, I simply do not have enough information to know what the best way to achieve that world is. I tend to have a pretty low view of what humanity, entire pool of knowledge and their ability to process all knowledge. We probably know this much, and if we had all knowledge accessible, we wouldn't even have the ability to process that. So in the end, it's faith. Faith that God has intervened through Christ in this world. He actually offers us eternal life, and what you and I both like is actually on the plan. It's just how to get there.
Awesome.
And for me, it's putting my faith in Christ for eternal life, and that he's going to deal with my problem of sin, which I am increasingly disgusted with. But I don't want to leave the listener with the idea that I'm a complete reprobate. Please, the bar goes up higher as the older I get, and I realize the higher the bar is, the worse I realize I am. But if the bar is just a pretty decent person.
Well, awesome. That covered all the topics I was hoping to talk with you about today. That was a great conversation. We've been going for like 2 hours. Thanks again for coming on.
Wow.
This was awesome.
Well, I enjoyed it, Tom. Thank you for the good discussion. I really enjoy your ability to come up with these ideas. It's always a pleasure to run into new objections, new ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate your thoughts and hearing you respond to my arguments. It's really helpful for me to process through my arguments as well. So I'm getting hungry. I need some more coffee too. So
Yeah, I haven't had lunch yet either.
so yep. So it was great talking with you. I'd love to talk with you again sometime. Thanks for coming
Yeah,
on, and I'll
sure.
talk with you later.
Enjoy that. Right on. Bye for now.
Bye for now.